Oh, you
Hello?
unmuted. Hey, buddy.
Hey, there we are.
How you doing?
Good, good. Let me just pause the stream. I was having trouble. Okay, yeah, sorry. Um, yeah, my Firefox wasn't playing Twitch for a little while, and I had to sort of. When I left, you were talking about Jordan Peterson. I came back, we were talking about taxing billionaires. So,
Yeah, yeah. We went all over the place.
yeah, it was pretty cool. I was the guy. I commented a little while ago, on the Jordan Peterson related stuff that I was also from Toronto because
Yeah, yeah.
I think I had I'm trying to think back. It's obviously a couple years ago now, but I thought that I had seen some of his videos before he really blew up because he had been doing stuff on some kind of local Ontario kind of public TV station
Mm-hmm.
for a really long time before he really kind of became an international sort of hit. So I feel like I had seen some of his older stuff, and a lot of it doesn't get as much attention. Like all of the clips. I mean, he's got a million of them now, but like I'd also watched the Hassan thing. I kind of like just kind of skimmed through it to see where he was going with it, and it's pretty interesting. Like I was kind of enjoying some of your takes on it, and generally I think I agree with kind of your line of reasoning in terms of the way that people sort of try and go after him, but they just kind of get into they just kind of jump into the drama and the culture war side of it without really kind of breaking everything apart.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's kind of where particularly some of his older stuff, kind of comes into play. So he's got some really great, some really funny old stuff that people have kind of dug up a few times. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll post a few things in the chat here. So this is probably like his cringiest of the cringe video that ever existed there. So that's him. I mean, people will have to take a look. It's pretty funny, but specifically related to, let's try and find it here. Um, it was really kind of the Bill C-16 stuff that sort of launched him, launched him
Yeah.
into fame. But I think the interesting thing is he kind of has
Honest man out of him.
so many different things that he's addressed. That's another challenge for people is parsing out, um, what they're criticizing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, he got a lot of flack for the Bill 16 thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, people call him a transphobe, and that sort of laid the basis to just hate him in general and criticize everything. Where some of his other stuff, his actual sort of academic work, is pretty kind of regular milquetoast stuff. And so you have people who will go after, like a lot of what Hassan did in terms of going after all these other interviews where he says all this weird stuff on the basis of he's a conservative, pushing all these conservative ideas,
Mm-hmm.
which in some cases is sort of true, but again, it kind of is just jumping to this drama culture war thing as opposed to really kind of breaking everything down. So I think one of the better things kind of addressing the C-16 drama was this. Here, I'll post it in the chat here. So this is a debate that he did at U of T
Mm-hmm.
when he was still a professor there when this all started. I think this probably a little bit before, he'd really gained a lot of fame for this.
Mm-hmm.
When he was still doing kind of smaller Canadian media here and there. So this is from November 21st, 2016.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually a debate on Bill 616 between him, a lawyer, and another, I think, like a gender studies professor from the West Coast or something like that. And I think the most interesting thing about it is the lawyer telling him, "You do not understand this law. It is not going to do what you say it is." Right. And again, this is before, a lot of it kind of really blew up, and I think is, where a lot of these kind of more true or more meaningful criticisms can kind of come into play in terms of that specific issue is that uh, those we in Canada still have a legal apparatus to protect people's freedom of speech and rights. We
Mm-hmm.
actually technically don't have quote unquote freedom of speech. It's actually freedom of religion. So we do have laws against like Holocaust denial and things like that. So it's not
Right.
quite the same, but we still have civil liberties associations and things like that, and legal mechanisms where if the government actually tried to pass a law that limited people's rights or did anything close to what he was claiming that it would do,
Mm-hmm.
those all sorts of people before some random psychology professor that would step in and do something about it. And so that's kind of the case that is laid out to him in this video is, hey, look, you don't understand this law. You don't know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We have these institutions that address these things, and as the phrase I used before, he's out to lunch, right? He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably where one of the more substantial criticisms of him comes out of is as a sort of grifter. Not that he didn't really believe the things that he was saying. He probably did, but just that he really sort of made and launched his career off of what was essentially a lie that he should have known, right? That's where I think the significance of this video comes in, is that he had a lawyer who knows the law tell him that this is wrong,
Right.
that is, you know what I mean? And he still, this is very early on, and he still kind of went with it, and it sort of launched his career. Now, the other issue is that this is not really what people criticize Jordan Peterson about anymore at all. It's not about his Bill C-16. He's come out with his 12 Rules for Life and all this stuff. And so that's sort of an issue as well, is that he really launched his career on this issue and then kind of left it behind. Where, and it was sort of a bit of a sham, I guess you could say, where, he launched it off of this, arguably quite transphobic issue. And then once he was famous, he was like, okay, well, now I can get a book deal. Now I can do all this other stuff. So as much as there's, as you were sort of getting into some of the more philosophical and technical issues around some of his comments and stuff, I think the main thing, and this is kind of what lies behind a lot of people's criticism, whether they know it or not, even though the criticisms that they're making are not as well founded, is that it comes out of this this issue where he again launched his career off of this very kind of damaging lie, basically.
So, right. So I could understand the perspective of approaching him in that regard, where you say, hey, because of these views, because they are ungrounded, because of the situation I've witnessed in this debate, I can understand believing that he got his start in bad faith and then just capitalized on that. But I believe that his interpretation, whether wrong or not, I do believe it was in good faith. Someone that was talking about this with me yesterday, and they linked this to me. Again, they quoted it. I didn't get a source or anything, but basically, quote, the bill adds, quote, gender identity or expression, end quote, to the list of prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act and the list of characteristics of identifiable groups protected from hate propaganda in the criminal code. It also adds that evidence that an offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on a person's gender identity or expression constitutes an aggravating circumstance for a court to consider when imposing a criminal sentence. Now, I have not researched the law to any great extent, but I have watched him talk about this a few times. I've not seen the full video of this Toronto Academic Public Forum, but I have seen him talk about it. So first, let me say, for those new, I support trans rights. I believe that we should not discriminate based on gender, but I'm now going to give a charitable take about Jordan Peterson's take. Mm-hmm. And what I believe he means, and it's good to hear that this isn't the case, because if I were to say, I could worry about too, but what he has said from things I've watched is regards to this line. It also adds that evidence that an offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate based on a person's gender identity or expression constitutes an aggravating circumstance for a court to consider when imposing a criminal sentence. To me, this basically says, like, if you fucking do something to someone and then you don't use their preferred pronouns, that could be used against you. And that my interpretation of Jordan's interpretation, or my understanding rather of Jordan's interpretation, is that someone could choose to use pronouns that aren't well used throughout the gender non-conforming communities. And like they could just make up and say Clerk and Clark are my pronouns, right? And if they say that and you don't abide by that you could be held. And what you're saying is that lawyer said that is not the case.
Yeah, so I think this is the thing is, like, even hearing you speak that, like, you're reading out these legal terms, and the problem I think is, and I'm not a legal expert either, is that legal language is is interpreted in very, very specific ways. So like when we read those things, we're kind of interpreting it with our kind of lay person understanding,
Mm-hmm.
when they actually mean some very specific things in terms of the rest of the law. So and again, yeah, so I live in the jurisdiction where this law applies,
Mm-hmm.
and you would not even notice. Nothing has changed in Canada fundamentally. No one has been charged or sent to jail for using the wrong pronouns and stuff like that. So but I definitely sympathize with you where, and my own hearing of Jordan Peterson's take on that, it sort of makes sense. Where if you're thinking, well, if someone, well, his argument, I remember, hinged on this idea of compelled speech, where he's saying
Mm-hmm.
that what this law is effectively doing is saying that I have to use certain language to refer to people if they tell me to, right? That I can't just
Mm-hmm.
decide what language I want to use. I'm being, being enforced on me. And this is actually something in that debate that I posted that they do some questions later, and they really kind of mess this up where they try and make this comparison to the N word, and he's like, no, it's not the same at all, because you're not limiting something that someone can say. You're telling someone what they have to say. And the problem with that, again, the problem with is none of this. This is all, this is all sort of besides the point, because none of this really applies in the context of the law. So, my understanding of these kinds of laws, and it's similar to a lot of the issues that come up with, TOS on social media platforms, where it's the same way. What the law is trying to protect is really more targeted harassment, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
where it's not simply not using the right someone's pronouns isn't going to send you to jail. The other thing I think we have to remember is that when you say, oh, if you don't use someone's pronouns, it's like, well, for you to be charged under this law, someone has to file charges against you, right? It's not just a matter of if someone overhears you using the wrong pronouns, they can call the police on you. It's that the person, um, there would have to be a person, potentially whose pronouns you're misusing or something like that, would actually have to lay charges against you and then, prove it in court or go through some kind of process, right? So that's kind of really the reality that we're talking about, where it's not just if you misbehave, people can come after you. There's a whole legal system in place that, again, already exists for all of these other categories, and they've just added that category in. And so adding that category simply makes it abide by the same rules and the same legal mechanisms that exist for everything else, right? So I think this is kind of the other argument where it's like it's not really changing the law at all. It's really just adding something. Now, I think there is an argument to say that this that pronouns are a bit of a different category. That that
Mm-hmm.
adding this is a little bit different than some of those other ones, but there's an oversimplification of saying, oh well, there's some compelled speech here, and it's like, no, this is really only going to apply. Well, the example I thought of is in the case of someone like Jordan Peterson. He wouldn't go to jail. I mean, it starts with fines and things like that, but he wouldn't be punished for misusing. Let's say he's a professor, or he was a professor, and he's giving a class, and he doesn't use someone's proper pronouns. Can they charge him for that? No, absolutely not. If he were to say, if someone could prove, again, they would have to prove this through some kind of legal mechanism. If a transgender person could prove that he was giving them a lower mark simply because they were transgender, or
Right.
actually discriminated against them specifically, if they were actually targeting them for their gender identity, then that person would have a case. But again, they would still have to make that case in a court. In terms of the sort of pronouns, again, he was kind of pointing mainly at, and there's other interviews here where, he would kind of clarify that he's really just talking about these, I think, what are called neo pronouns, like the Z and the Zer and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
where he simply doesn't recognize the legitimacy of those,
Mm-hmm.
and that I think is still an issue, like kind of even in the trans community in some places, where not everyone necessarily agrees on them, but at this point, I think the sort of few enough and far between that not enough people use them that it maybe it just hasn't become an issue. But again, it's not him just refusing to use them wouldn't necessarily get him in trouble. It really has to be something more concrete that someone would actually be able to bring charges against him for.
Yeah, so that makes sense to me. I still think that his ascension through that argument was done in good faith on his part. Um, I see what you're saying though, as far as the explanation of the law. And while I haven't looked into it, I'm going to take at your word that your interpretation is correct. But I can see where from the I read the C6. I did read the C16 bill. Obviously, I'm not a Canadian lawyer or a lawyer in general, so my interpretation of it's going to be way different, right? As you said, I'm a lay person, and so my interpretation is not going to be accurate. But I could see where he got to his perspective from him also operating as a layperson, right? So
Yeah,
I just don't think it
yes
was
and no.
done in a way that was trying to be inflammatory towards the LGBT community or the trans community in particular, or gender nonconforming communities. I'm sorry, is that an offensive term? I don't know. Gender nonconforming is what's used to refer to
Yeah.
children who don't abide by, or people that don't abide by the constructs of what we believe to be masculine or male and female. So I don't know if that's a fucking wrong term to use or not. A
I
lot of
think
language
it is.
around the shit. But yeah, so I think I don't know. I just don't think he was engaging in that in like a bad faith way, whether it was to grift or self promote. I think he genuinely saw it as an issue. Um,
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think it's. I mean, you really kind of would have to kind of get into his mind a little bit.
mhm,
I think it could kind of go either way. Like those, certainly, if you look at some of what he did at the time, it seemed like it was in good faith. It was certainly a lot of work, and he really put himself out there, for it to be all a bit of a show.
mhm,
I think on the one hand, so there's two issues. One, again, this is why I think that original debate is a little bit significant because you have, on tape a lawyer telling him that he's wrong. So at that point, he didn't reevaluate. He didn't really do anything. Now, again, if he was already sort of invested, if he had already made up his mind, he's not going to, you know, well, so this is actually the thing. When Hassan went over that clip where he's being interviewed by the comedian, and he kind of changes his mind
mhm,
about kind of live on air. That I think is actually pretty interesting. I think people kind of, I think people should actually do that more often. It's not the greatest
mhm.
example because we're dealing with Jordan Peterson in this context, but I think that's a place where we could go. Actually, that's exactly what people should do, right? If you're having a conversation with somebody and someone points out an inconsistency in your views, you should be able to kind of adapt to that and not, But in this case, it's people saying, "Oh, look, he just got blown out by a comedian. And he's such an idiot," as opposed to saying like,
Oh,
"Hey, like this is actually the way the thought process could work." So on the other hand, it seems like he didn't do that when confronted by this lawyer. So I think there's an argument to say, well, no, he should have known better, or there were opportunities where he could have been corrected, but he sort of kept going. And so I think there's evidence to both sides of that argument. One, that he generally thought this law could lead to this, and on the other hand, it's like, well, he could have and should have known better from pretty early on to kind of adjust things, and he didn't do that, and he really kind of took it to its logical conclusion. And again, I'm still a little bit suspicious, especially being aware of all of the media that he had done for quite a while before that. And so there's some suspicion to believe that he may have sort of known a little bit of what he was doing, uh, and really, you know, uh, and really sort of used it, milked it for what he could get out of it. Because then on the other side, he did kind of leave it behind pretty quickly. And I think I've heard anyway that he has sort of turned around and said, "Oh yeah, I was wrong about Bill C-16, and it didn't actually do what I thought it did." But at this point, he's famous for all of this other stuff
mhm.
anyway, right? So it's kind of hard to say, but I think, and all of that is even just one kind of point of contention,
Right.
just for me, again, because of my background, because like this kind of happened in my hometown, so to speak. It was sort of in my backyard, and I followed it pretty closely at the time. And I think that was the other thing, was seeing how it sort of morphed into all of this other stuff as he took on all of these other issues and did all this other stuff. And I think that's where your criticism of Hassan's criticism really comes into play, because that's really where the sort of rubber hits the road. It's like, okay, you know, there's some drama around Bill C-16, and that kind of got left in the dust. But you know, his real legacy is going to be all this stuff about cultural Marxism and like,
Right.
All of this
Yeah.
kind of culture war stuff.
So I would have to. This is one of those moments where it's like, for me to give a good response to it, I'd have to see the engagement between them. Because my question would definitely be, how did the lawyer engage with him? Because I don't think it's very uncommon for people to have misinterpretations of the law within the legal community itself, let alone between laymen, right? Like, people are always going to look to the law and say, see, haha, but then you have to have someone come in and interpret it for you sometimes, because sometimes they're not clear cut and straightforward. So I'm very curious to see how this lawyer goes into the C-16 bill with Jordan Peterson, because how he approaches it will determine how I view whether or not he was open-minded enough to engage properly. Like, to where I can say, okay, he was engaging in good faith or bad faith. Because he might have just been like brushing him the fuck off and saying, that's not the way. But I could see myself personally getting hung up on a few lines and be like, this isn't clear enough. This looks to me like it leaves it open. This doesn't seem to be explicitly attached to other civil rights bills. I'm sorry, 1 second. I gotta mute me for a second.
Yep.
Apologies. I had to make sure my roommate's kid wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just playing Beyblades.
No worries.
It was
Really?
making
Are
a
those
lot
kids
of
still around? Oh
yeah,
my
and
God.
it was making a lot of noise. So I thought he was breaking shit. Anyway, what was I saying?
In regards to how the lawyer.
So how the lawyer engaged with him, like, and how in depth they went into that discussion. That's going to be the determining factor for me. Just because if the lawyer didn't engage with him and like take him seriously, or engage with him in good faith, or work in a tactful way to explain to him why this isn't what he thinks it is, then of course he's going to be not effective at getting him to come around or reinforce Jordan's beliefs, or just do nothing good as far as like disproving him,
Yeah, no, I think that's like a very central point, especially to kind of your criticism of Hassan, and I think is something that actually makes that debate all the more interesting. So, the lawyer, she was pretty reasonable. I have to go back to see exactly, her exact approach of trying to explain it. I know that she wasn't, in any way condescending or something like that. She was, I think, pretty clear and again reasonable, and not not too over the top or anything. I think she did a pretty good job. Again, you kind of have to go and see exactly the dynamic between them. But the real interesting about that debate was, I think I mentioned there was another, I think, kind of gender studies professor from, I believe she was from UBC, so a university over in British Columbia, and their approach was very different from that of the lawyers. So this is something that I think, and in some ways now that I'm realizing it, really kind of foreshadowed a lot of the criticisms of Jordan Peterson was, you can have the reasonable approach that the lawyer took, or this much less reasonable approach that this other gender studies professor, I believe they were gender studies professor, took, where they were basically just like deriding him and basically yelling at him and saying all sorts of kind of weird stuff. Like, maybe they had some arguments in there, but in my opinion, they were absolutely approaching the debate in pretty bad faith. They had clearly already made up their mind that they didn't like him, and that's what they were, that's what they were expressing in their contributions to that. And I think that is really the approach that a lot of people, and maybe to some degree, as you may argue, Hassan is taking here, is that, you can, either kind of approach it very soberly and say, okay, I'm not going to get into the drama. I'm not going to, get into some of the culture war stuff, and I'm just going to, try and address, the problems with his ideas as soberly as possible. Or, you can kind of, jump in and have basically a mud wrestling match. And, as much as he may be doing or saying transphobic things or something like that, just kind of, again, screaming at him that he's a transphobe and not really backing it up and stuff like that is only going to make the problem worse. And I think that is the approach that a lot of people sort of took, right? Not that it doesn't necessarily have a basis, because, he's still problematic in all sorts of ways. But as you're pointing out, even if he was acting in bad faith, if you return, if you also act in bad faith, then you're really only making everything worse.
Yep.
And I think that a lot of people took that approach, and it was, and that was a part of what made him so famous, right? Was, if you take a look at the famous Channel 4 interview, the thing that made that interview so kind of monumental and made him so much more famous was not that his answers were really that good, but that the questions were so bad, right? It's that, that the criticisms of him were, either in bad faith or just not very well.
The usual unfounded, just the usual hyperbolic misinterpretation or misprocessing of his messaging. Like basically taking, whatever liberal internet discourse we would see about Jordan Peterson and, boiling it down into some talking points. You don't get the accurate picture of Jordan, and therefore when you try to engage with him from those premises, he has a severely easy time, like just pushing back on it. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and this is exactly what you saw, particularly from a lot of his fans, where it's like, oh, well, you're taking him out of context, or you don't really understand his ideas. You have to go and watch all of his lectures that, you just simply don't understand. And that can sound, maybe for a third party that might not be engaged in either side of the debate, that sounds pretty attractive because, yeah, some of these criticisms don't necessarily line up. I think this actually speaks to something that I thought about, political discussions for quite a while, is that they're kind of like Jeopardy. Rest in peace, Alex Trebek. I actually went to the same high school as Alex Trebek. But
shit.
So in Jeopardy, when you go to answer a question, right, you pick out your category and you pick out the kind of the wager. You're actually making a bet where, yes, if you get the answer right, you get that amount of money. But if you get the answer wrong, you lose that amount of money, right? And so I think politics and political debate can often be the same sometimes. Where if you go in to criticize a guy like Jordan Peterson, sure, if you have sound criticism and it's good, then then you can move forward. Where on the other hand, if your criticisms are bad and they don't really do justice to the topic, or they just they don't land, or they're incorrect, or they misinterpret some of his ideas, it can have the opposite effect, and it can you're kind of almost making a martyr out of him, which is a lot of the cases what happened, where you actually almost disprove your own point and make him look more correct by launching ineffective criticisms. And so I think that's a large part of what lies behind a lot of his success, was that it just spoke this a lot of these culture war based debates where people just kind of got into it, and there wasn't really a sober criticism, which I think is what you were sort of trying to get after.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not the idea that Jordan Peterson is infallible. In fact, I'm very much trying to be clear that I have someone that was introduced to Jordan Peterson through Joe Rogan and thought this guy just seems like a rational dude who hates fucking crazy social justice warriors. And the more I've opened myself up to his content, the more I've realized, like, no, he does have a lot of problematic ideas, but I just don't think that any of them are to the extent that he gets criticized by a lot of the mainstream. And so that it's like, even as I've turned against him, so to speak, I still don't see him in the light that everyone else seems to. And I don't think it's because I'm being unreasonable. I think it's because I'm being reasonable. And the thing I'm trying to highlight with this on is, one, the fact that the biggest political force on Twitch doesn't operate in an informative and educated way, despite being a Rutgers educated individual. And I know him to be intelligent, but he's more performative. And in doing so, I also am picking apart that he's got a target where there are much more intellectual conversations to be had, whether or not an anthropological approach to things like gay marriage is appropriate, for instance. It's a way more nuanced conversation to have than is LOL, hate the gays. Yeah. So I have to go. I hate to be vulgar. LOL Cookie, I see you in there. But I have to pee and I have to get lunch ready. I have steaks that have been sous videing since like 6 this morning. Yeah. So I got to go do that. But hey, Phone, I really appreciate the conversation. You've given me a lot to look at and to think about. I definitely.
Hey, if you ever want to talk to Jordan Peterson, I'm your guy.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Do you have anything you want to shout out?
No, not quite. I don't have any channels or anything like that. I think the last thing I'm going to post in the chat is a video of Jordan Peterson that a lot of people take clips from, where it's his kind of main thing where he talks about a lot of his ideas of cultural Marxism and stuff. But the thing that I find interesting that everyone misses is that the host of, not the host of the debate, but the person that they hired to kind of say the introductions and stuff like that is was one of the most prominent Canadian neo-Nazis. And so she's sitting in the background of the video the whole time, and no one ever really notices this, and doesn't really realize that like any half decent person would not be caught in the same room with this woman. So I'm gonna post that.
That's funny.
People's entertainment.
Thanks, brother. You have a great one, dude. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Bye. My name is Larkin. Please subscribe to my channel, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. I need your subs and I need your support so I can grow my shit bigger. Please, oh please, I don't need donations, just need your follows and adorations. Please, 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 please like, subscribe, and follow.